everyone, it's Patricia. Welcome back to the Bad Chinese Teacher podcast. This week, I got to sit down with an old friend whose voice should sound familiar to you if you've listened to the Model Congress episodes from a few weeks back. Katrina Perito has 2 degrees in French, but don't ask her if she's planning on becoming a French teacher anytime soon, because she's living proof that being multilingual can open up far more career opportunities than just teaching language. Katrina currently works for the French government as a trade advisor for sports, culture, and tourism with the trade mission of the French embassy, where she uses French at her job every day. I had a ton of fun recording this episode with Katrina because we hit on just about every practical topic and question you could possibly have about living and learning and working as a multilingual person. Choosing a language to study, studying and living and working abroad, making friends and choosing which language to communicate with them, angsting over accents, and also that one time Katrina had to interpret a speech on the spot and receive some very unexpected feedback shortly afterwards. There's just too much to summarize here, so let's dive into this week's episode for some heavily #relatable multilingual content. Enjoy. I still remember when we were in 6th grade, which is like the time where you choose which language you want to take throughout middle school and therefore for the rest of your life. And so you chose French, I chose Spanish. I can't remember why I chose Spanish, but I remember you being super insistent that, like, I should switch over to French, or that, like, literally everyone should switch over to French. Do you still feel that way now, that people who are us peasants who, like, learn Spanish should reconsider learning French?
I don't know if I would say reconsider, but I do know I felt super strongly at the time, which is hilarious because when I think about it, you take, like, whatever, 4 months of a trimester of Spanish, a trimester of French, and then it's like pick for the rest of your life, or until you're willing to switch to Latin in high school, right. And which I didn't want to do. But I remember being like, oh, I really liked French. I thought it was really beautiful language and stuff. And then also added to the fact that once I started saying, oh, I think I might want to do French instead of Spanish, everyone was like, oh, well, Spanish is easier. You should do Spanish because it's easier. It's much more useful. I don't know why you would take French, blah, blah, blah. And as soon as they told me, like, no one does French, it's the harder one, I was like, okay, so I'm doing French because no one wants me to do it. And if they don't want me to do it, that's what I'm going to do. So that's how I started doing it. And then I was just sad that most of my friends weren't, so there was a higher chance that we would be on a different team because it was split up by language. But yeah, that's kind of how I picked it, which is a really kind of not random, because I did feel some attachment to it, but it was mostly, I think, pushed by the fact that people were like, oh, why would you do this? This is a stupid thing to do. And I was like, oh, is it? Like, I'll show you. And thus began my entire career.
Yeah, I feel like some things like that just happen so serendipitous, because you're right. I feel like how many people were in our graduating class? Like
275.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And so like 2/3 of the, because I know there are 3 teams in middle school, and so 2 of those teams are Spanish teams, and then the French team was not only just one, but it was very, very small.
Yeah, but it also had Spanish. There were some people in Spanish on the French team, so there were way less people taking French than there were taking Spanish.
I find it. I have that. So I have a very, it's this similar but very exaggerated version of that dynamic with my classes, because at our school we have Spanish and then Chinese, and so there's like 37 kids taking Spanish and then like 4 kids taking Chinese, and it definitely does feel kind of like this like Fight Club situation, where if you know, and but I remember being in middle school and like people who did French. I feel like taking French, in our school, but I think this is true in other schools too. It's kind of like an active choice.
Yeah.
And so for you continually made that choice beyond just high school, because you were a French major. Were you just a French major in college, or did you minor? Or?
I was a French major and an Arabic and theology minor.
Awesome.
Yeah, the theology was accidental because I went to a Jesuit school, so you just end up taking a lot of theology.
No, that's usually what happens. I became an accidental music minor as well, and it's just funny how those things stack up. But at least yours is like marketable and relevant. I'm just here like,
The Arabic was intentional, the theology was
yeah. So right now you still use French in your job, but you've also picked up a couple other languages along the way besides just French and Arabic. You also now do Spanish, which is ironic given the origin story of all of this. So French, Spanish, Arabic, and
I'm learning Italian.
And so when did Italian come in? When did you start learning that?
I started learning Italian, like self-learning via an app, while I was in France. to be honest, because they still call me by your name. And I learned that Timothée Chalamet kind of basically picked up Italian while he was on what do you call that, on shoot, and over 3 months, and he already spoke French. And I was like, well, if Timothée Chalamet can pick it up, like, I could. And I'm, I have Italian heritage, like, roots. And I found out that I can, because of the very complicated and weird way Italian citizenship works, which is not important for purposes of this podcast, but I can be an Italian citizen. And I was just kind of like, well, if I can have an Italian passport, I would feel super, like, a jerk for not speaking any Italian. I would just feel kind of, I'm taking advantage of this, like, great privilege, and I'm not even bothering to learn the language, especially when it's something that I already have, like, a basis for with other Romance languages. Like, it's not like I'm not at all familiar with it, and my grandma speaks Italian. So that's when I started doing the app, and then actually for my birthday, my boyfriend got me Italian classes, so I've been taking Italian adorable. Like once a week.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so which has been it's been interesting. I think I'm going to keep taking it in a more formal setting, because I'm trying to advance faster in Italian than I was with Spanish. Like, Spanish, I was just doing self-learning, and then I'm now at a point where I'm in a weird spot in between levels in Spanish, so I don't think a formal class would be helpful, because I understand everything. It's just getting me to speak is
right.
Yeah.
Right. So with the self-learning, you've been doing it, like you said, with mostly an app. Have you been, like, talking with, like, language partners, or, like, where's your community with all of that? With
Spanish, I was kind of doing, my mom is also learning Spanish, so we're learning Spanish together.
Oh, that's cute.
She is taking a class, or she was taking a class, and so, like, every time I came home, I would go to the class with her. And then I have 2 friends who live in Syria, and I try to talk to them in Spanish, and they're always trying to work on it. It's more of, like, I'll talk to them in Spanish, and then they talk to me in English, and then we correct each other.
I feel like that's so awkward, because a lot of my friends who speak Chinese are also really fluent in English, and so it's always this very strange, like, tango of deciding which language to speak with them, because on the one hand, I'm just like, I don't want to insult you with, like, my policy is, if your Chinese is better than my, or if your English is better than my Chinese, then let's just speak English. I'm not going to insult you with my Chinese skills when your English is clearly better than mine, but I'm glad we can empathize with each other on that.
Yeah.
People say that, like, once you start, like, the first language is always the hardest to learn, and then once you get, like, past, I don't know what the threshold is, like, maybe 2, maybe 3 languages, it just gets a lot easier, which is why you have these, like, polyglots who speak, like, 17 languages. Now, you will, like, have 5 technically under your belt.
Ish. Of varying levels, but
put that on your LinkedIn profile, like, I'm pretty sure all these, like, monolingual noobs will be impressed regardless. But, like, you also started learning them at different junctures in your life, and so did you find that it was easier as you went along?
Yeah, and I mean, that's why I think people get really discouraged with the whole, like, critical language theory being like, oh, well, I'm an adult, so I'm never gonna, I'm never gonna get to the point I want to be in whatever language because it's too late for me. And, I mean, that might be true in respect to your accent. Like, if you start learning, past the critical language point, I think that's when it's like you're always going to have an accent. You're never going to, even if you manage to get rid of somebody, it's always going to stay. But I think with the first one, it's just you have to totally wrap your brain around the fact that, like, a language works in a totally different way. And once you kind of realize, okay, there's different stuff like that, and you can either draw parallels or, I guess, draw perpendiculars with your language, it makes it easier to build off of. And so now, like, with Italian and Spanish, I'm always like, oh, it's like French. Okay, it's easy. So when I can do that, or if it's not like French, I'm like, okay, so that's different than French. It's like its own thing. So I think it does make it easier. It gives you tools so that you can apply. Language learning tools can be applied to whatever language.
That's true.
Even if the language is, like, a totally different base. Helps if it's a safe base, obviously.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's, like, one thing that I don't know, this is just something that came up with me, but I remember when I was studying Korean and Japanese in college, and, like, when you can't think of a word in the language that you're learning, the word that you want to say is not in English, but is in some other language. Yeah, like, I remember, like, being in Korean class and not being able to think of a word, but I could, like, say it in Spanish. But, does that happen did that happen to you?
That happens to me all the time. And this happens to me now, like, not to brag or whatever, but I think my French is, like, I would say I'm fluent in French. That's the one I would say I'm pretty much, like, I wouldn't say I'm bilingual just because I wasn't born a native speaker, but, like, in essence, I spend my whole day speaking French. Sometimes what will happen to me that sounds really pretentious when it happens, and I feel like I'm a jerk when it happens, but I'll be like, oh, what's the word for that in English? And people are like, that's such a pretend. Oh, what's the word for that in English? And I'm like, but sometimes I have a theory that there are certain words that resonate with you better in certain languages. So like, even if there is a translation, obviously there's words where there aren't a translation, but sometimes there is a translation in theory, but it just makes more sense to me in the other language, whether that is English or French. Like there's a word in French, se débrouiller, which basically means like to figure it out, to like get a handle on it, to take care of it, I guess. But it sounds just more like, people will be like, oh, well, how are you going to get all that stuff home from the office? And you're like, oh, I'll figure it out. But it just sounds better in French. It makes more sense to me on like an emotional level in French.
Yeah, I feel like that's when you've like really, I mean, you say that you're not bilingual, but I think once you've reached a point where you can connect, like when you can connect intangibles with a different language, then that to me is bilingualism, because you're not only just like speaking the mechanics of the language, you're also like thinking and feeling in that language, and that makes a big difference than just like knowing I mean, I feel like language learning is can be such a weirdly elitist place.
Oh,
right?
For sure.
Yeah, right? It's like, oh my gosh, it's the worst. But like, but you're right. I feel like there are definitely times where, I don't know, I always characterize this as me just becoming less fluent in English. Well, I say that sounds equally as elitist, to be honest. But like, but what I mean is like, people have a lot of like hang-ups about like their speaking, right? That tends to be like the hardest thing to do when you're in your second language or third language or whatever. And the one thing that kind of like that I kind of have a little bit of security on is knowing that in English I am sometimes equally as ineloquent, so it's not a matter of like, oh, like my ineloquence in this other language is just a side effect of me not being fluent. It's like, no, I'm just a socially awkward person that also would do the same things in English, so why am I giving myself such a hard time? Yeah, I think we mentioned earlier that like when we're picking languages in school, which oftentimes is the gateway drug to like either, I feel like at that time, because there were like you were a French major.
Yep.
There's another classmate in our grade that was also ended up being a French major. It's kind of one of those things that like languages is something that you start buying into. Some people start buying into when they're very, very young. And like we mentioned before, Spanish is like, and this still is seen as like the more relevant of the FIGS languages: French, Italian, German, Spanish. You're lucky if you get Italian and German in your school.
Yeah.
And yet you chose to pursue it anyway. Despite people saying that, like, a lot of people believing that, like, the only reason why you would learn a language is for utilitarian reasons, right? Why would you learn a language unless you could, I don't know, capitalize on it in some way that will make you money? Which is a terrible rationale to learn anything, but just my opinion. But the question remains though, like the relevance of French in, modern society. I feel like if you were to ask this question, like in like the 1950s
or 60s,
like the people, I mean, Spanish wouldn't even really be on the map at the point. It was like French or German. What's funny is that like in the 1950s and 60s, Japanese was also supposed to be like the next big language, and see how that turned out. So we're dealing with a situation where like people are, in an era where people are like only see language as being kind of like, something that you have to use. What then compels you to still study French, pursue French, despite its lack of, I don't know, relevance or trendiness? And
Well, I could start with I will get to the question, but I first want to tell a quick story about why I started focusing on French, because, again, not to sound like a jerk, but I was a pretty good student, so I was good at French, but I was also good at other subjects, so it wasn't like, oh, I'm getting an A in French, but I'm failing in this other classes. Like, I was kind of getting A's. And I remember at 8th grade awards night, I had a teacher, Mr. Flood, so shout out to Mr. Flood, because his class was insane, and at the time I thought it was crazy, and then, like, it just actually had a huge effect on me, which I didn't realize at the time.
That's awesome.
But I remember he was getting up to give the French award, and he starts describing this person who's like super passionate about the language and all this stuff, and I'm like, I don't know who that could be. And then it was me, and I remember being so shocked that I got this award, and he was like, you're really good at this, like, you should keep doing this, you love it, and all this stuff. And I was like, I really credit him, because he saw something in me that I didn't necessarily see in myself. I was like, yeah, I like French, but like, it's a school subject. I want to do well in school, so whatever. Once he kind of, opened that door for me to be like, hey, maybe you have a talent for this, maybe you're... Well, I should say also that I think that some people are more inclined and motivated to learn languages. I don't think there's people will be like, oh, I'm bad at languages. Like, no, I don't think that it's like that, really. I think it's a lot more about motivation than it is about like natural skills, because if you think about it, people who might not be academically inclined might grow up in a bilingual household and speak 2 languages. That doesn't mean that they're smarter or less smart than you. It has nothing to do with your intelligence. It has to do with your environment and your motivation. So that's one thing. But he kind of opened the door to me being like, oh, well, maybe I am interested in this. Maybe this is something I want to pursue. And so it was in high school where I was really like, okay, I definitely want to keep doing this. I'm interested in French. I'm interested in how I could apply this in a career. When I started looking at colleges, I looked at colleges that were really international relations, the language focus, like I really wanted to go to school in DC. And, like, where I ended up going is, like, one of the top, like, language and IR schools in the country. So that was, like, kind of really what motivated me at the time, still not really knowing what I would do with it, right? Like, when people were like, oh, well, what do you want to do when you grow up? I was like, I want to use French in my job. And, is it really relevant? No. I mean, if you'd say to someone, which language would you pick only based on usefulness, I would say Spanish, just because even in the U.S., even far away from Latin America where we're based, you would still, like, you could use Spanish every day in Connecticut if you wanted to. Mm-hmm. And you're not really going to use French unless you live in, like, Montpelier in Vermont or on the border of Canada. But, I mean, does that mean you shouldn't learn it? No. And I think also it's a lot more relevant if you start thinking about really more of a global context. Like in Europe, a lot of people speak French. If you go to Italy, you'll find like the second language as French or Spanish. So I think, or, if you're interested in development, human rights, like all Francophone Africa is a super, super interesting area where a ton of stuff is going to be happening in the upcoming years. So I don't think it's like not relevant. I can see the argument for learning Spanish is more useful, learning Spanish is more relevant, but it's not necessarily, if you like it, what does it really matter? You'll find a way to apply it, like if Hungarian was offered and I thought Hungarian was super interesting, I would find a way to use Hungarian later on. It's never a bad thing to speak a language. And I was going to be like, oh, what a handicap, you speak 2 languages. Like, that was a waste of time. Like, no, it's not a waste of time. It teaches you a new way to think too, it really changes your brain, which I think is important, whichever language you pick.
Yeah, I think one of the things, it definitely does. And I think like one thing that when you are in a monolingual society, you kind of have to, have a really good reason to want to, like, people would say like you should only spend time and energy on learning this, objectively very unnecessary thing unless it's going to serve some sort of like material purpose, right? Which I think is understandable. I feel it's a very American way of looking at things. Sure. Yeah, for sure. But the thing is, like, I feel even with that, even if that's your reason, right? I mean, I have students who are just like, I'm learning Chinese because my dad's a businessman and I want to be a businessman like my dad. Purest intentions ever. 7th grade, adorable. But on the one hand, I love hearing that. On the other hand, I'm just like, if that's your only reason, I'm afraid that you might burn out very quickly. Because the thing is, like, if you're attaching this to some sort of like, career goal, that changes too, right? And so if you don't pin that to something, if you pin it to something that's so like variable, then there's it's a very shaky ground to like put a lot of time and energy onto. You really have to work hard to justify it if you're using reasons other than just pure intrinsic, interest. It's like, I feel like it's like learning art or learning an instrument, you know what I mean? Like, no one learns that to make money. Quite the opposite. Yeah. And so you have to have some sort of ulterior sort of something propelling you forward. So you're using French every day now, which I think was, like you mentioned, was like your so congratulations on achieving your dreams. What do you do for work now?
So now I work as a trade advisor for a branch of the French government in New York. So basically I help French companies come to the United States, whether that's through generating a market study or putting them in contact with partners and distributors or setting up startup accelerators or helping them go to trade shows, like lots of different things like that. So it's really awesome. Like, I love it. All my colleagues are French. I get to go to France like probably once or twice a year. So it's really like what I wanted to be doing. I started doing that in May, and before that I was living in France for a year, also working. Yeah.
Do you primarily speak French at work?
I only speak French at work, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I occasionally will speak English with my one coworker, one of my coworkers' husbands is American, so he likes kind of is always in between. Like, we're always just kind of switching back and forth. I have another coworker who specifically asked me that he really wants to work on his, like, he wants to speak with a native speaker. So when we are just one-on-one, we'll speak in English. But again, even with him, if we're in a group, like, it's kind of weird to speak in English because I'm the only, like, native English speaker there. Everybody else is... I mean, all of them have very good levels of English, but, like, everybody there is French, so it's kind of, like, I'd be imposing my... like, everyone has to speak English because I speak English. Like, I'm in their environment, so it's kind of on me to
But this is still,
adapt.
like, a company based in the... I mean, not a company based in, but, like, your workplace.
Yeah, my workplace is in the U.S., yeah. But I do have a lot of counterparts in Paris. I have, like, a counterpart that I talk to a lot in Paris. But my coworkers are... My team is based... between New York, Montreal, Toronto, and San Francisco.
Wow.
So my direct coworkers I'm frequently with them, like, via Skype and stuff. So
yeah, that's so, like, I mean, I'm in a similar place. I came to the realization recently that I have to do probably all my job interviews here and out in Chinese, which job interviews are, like, hard enough as is, and, like, just, like, anxiety. But, you know, that being said, like, navigating a work environment in English is hard enough. Like, how is doing that in French, like...
I mean, I'm glad that, like, I will say, so I did my master's also in French, and one of the classes I took was about intercultural management, which is basically about, you know, basically a class about cultural differences. Like, there's all these, it's actually a really good book, and now I can't remember the name of it. I want to say it's called The Cultural Map or something. It's by Erin Meyer. It's really good. She's a cultural consultant, and she evaluates cultures based on 8 different axes. English is not my first language, apparently. So basically, it's like how your culture relates to time, how your culture relates to authority, and so you rate them on different scales. So, you know, like direct and indirect communication. So, like, one thing that's really interesting is in America specifically, but in Anglophone cultures in general, we're a very direct communication culture. So if someone wants you to do something, they will tell you to do it. If someone doesn't like what you're doing, they'll tell you. Everything is very explicit, whereas in France, it's an indirect communication culture, so they're a lot more, you know, they're direct in terms of criticism, and they're indirect in terms of everything else, which means that you can kind of, which I'm really glad I had this class before I went to go work in France, because I would go to these, like, weekly meetings I'd have with my supervisor, and I would just hear about everything I was doing wrong. And first I was discouraged, but then I remembered what we learned in class, and it was basically like, if you're doing something right, they have they don't see the need to tell you, because it's like, well, you're doing it right, so why would I give you extra compliments on that? I'm only going to tell you what you're doing wrong, which can be a very, like, you know, especially when you're raised in America, where you're used to being like, you're doing great, everything's amazing, everything's awesome, you know, I mean, that's a stereotype, but it's also kind of true, right?
Yeah.
Like, French, you know, an American person, if you're doing a performance review, they would probably be like, well, this year you did really great in this, and this. Next year, I think you could work on this, and this. Whereas in a French one, they would skip right to the second part, and so you might be kind of like, but I did so much great work, like, why wasn't it, you know, valorized or whatever? It's not an English word either, but yeah, so I think that's like kind of, sometimes that is, like, kind of difficult. I just have to kind of remember that aspect of it. And when I was in France, I did have the advantage of, like, really, really not being in my own country, you know, so if I did ever kind of screw up, I could kind of be like, I'm sorry, I'm American, I don't know what's going on.
The foreigner rule.
Yeah, which is like, you know, you gotta lean into that when you can. So.
You do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wild. I want to walk back a little bit to, again, the decision-making process to learn French, but again, I feel if you're learning a language for the sake of learning a language that doesn't have sort of a capitalistic purpose, you get a lot of pushback for, like, you know, wasting your time, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm speaking this from a perspective who, like, my parents spent, like, upwards of $200,000, and my dad's takeaway was like, so you're spending all this money for you to learn Chinese, and I'm like, but it's important. But you encountered something really interesting that I didn't encounter when I was studying languages, was that, like, when you were studying French, people were like, why would you spend all this time if you weren't going to be a French teacher? I didn't know that dynamic existed, this idea that, like, if you're learning French, and I guess by relation Spanish, you're not Spanish or from French or from a Spanish speaking background, like, there's no reason for you to learn unless you want to become a teacher. What's that all about? That's so strange to me.
I think that I would say I didn't get that reaction necessarily like at school because, like I said, I went to a very like international focused school. So everybody was required to take 4 semesters of a language, and I was a language major, and I was required to take 4 semesters of a second language. And the school foreign service students were required to pass a proficiency exam in at least one language. So that was a lot less at school and more of, you know, like when I would come home and say to people I'm majoring in French, be like, oh, you want to be a French teacher? And so first, like, big disclaimer, like, obviously I love language teachers. There's nothing wrong with being a language teacher.
Thank you.
That's like, I mean, that's a very noble career path. Like, more power to everybody who does that. I knew straight from the beginning, I was like, no, like, I'm not patient. I really enjoy teaching, like, learning a language, and so when other people aren't getting it as quickly, or we're, you know, it's like I get really frustrated. It sounds like a really jerky thing to say, but
totally understand.
So I knew from the beginning, I was like, I don't want to be a language teacher. It's not for me. But when I would come back to, you know, Brantford and be like, oh yeah, I'm majoring in French, and people would just say like, oh, so you want to teach? And I'd be like, no, like there are other things you can do, and maybe that's just because again we live in a very monolingual society where people are like, well, what would you do with that other than teach? Which is again something that is very noble, but not what I wanted to do. And I just kind of was like, I don't know necessarily what the options are. And I do feel like a problem with the way it was taught in school was like, I wasn't ever really exposed in school to what can you do if you continue learning French? Like what are the options out there for you if you want to do a language and not teach? Like, is there a response to people who are like, is there a monetary value to taking this? As we said, that's not really why you should motivate yourself to learn a language, but like, yeah, again, if you're going to spend $200,000 on education to learn it, which I did, like, you kind of want to get a job at the end of it. So what is that job, you know? So I do think that that's, like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know why that's, like, necessarily in people's heads, but part of the reason I wanted to, like, talk on the podcast is that I do think that if you want to be a language teacher, like, that's awesome. Definitely go do that. But if you don't, like, there's so many career paths that are open to you speaking another language, whether it's just as, like, oh, this is a plus on your resume, or it's like me where I do this every day, you know, like I wouldn't have been able to do any of the jobs that I've had in my professional career, which there haven't been that many because I'm not that old, but like all of the jobs I got was based on having like a bilingual level of French.
That's interesting. Yeah, what are some examples of some of those jobs that you encountered or had?
What I did before, you mean?
Yeah.
So first when I could say, for instance, that the reasons I don't want to be a language teacher, when I first graduated Georgetown, I was really like, I still didn't really know, you know, after 4 years, I was still responding to the question, what do you want to do, is with, I want to speak French on a day-to-day basis. And not teach. But I really wanted to go back to France after studying abroad. So I did this teaching program run by the French government where I could go teach English in a French high school. Which is interesting and like
seems like the opposite of all the things you wanted to do in terms of like
not teaching. And also the other thing is French. That they have the impression that like, oh, you know how to teach, which like I didn't. And they also in France they have a very heavy grammar, even with French they learn a lot of French grammar. And we don't learn any English grammar. The only English grammar I know is from learning other languages. And so, you know, they'd be like, oh, well, you know, why is this way? And I was like, is that a thing? I don't know. I mean, sure. Yeah, whatever. Sounds right. And anytime the teachers would sometimes say stuff wrong, which they would, sometimes I'd be like, I guess that's probably just how they say it in British English. Like, I don't know. Yeah. So I did that for a year. Then I came back and I loved it. Like, I mean, I did really love, like, interacting with my students. They were preparing for their, like, end of high school exams, so it was, like, a high-stress environment for them, but it was, like, super formative for me. Where was this? In Normandy.
Oh, okay.
So, kind of in the middle of nowhere. No one will know where it is, but about an hour from the D-Day beaches. And so that was really great for me. And I progressed so much in French because I never had the temptation to speak in English except for when I was working. Like, no one spoke English. There was no one in Paris. Sometimes people would hear my accent and be like, oh, I'm going to speak to you in English. Whereas, like, people in where I was living, yeah, you know, they had no idea. So then I came back to the US and I worked at the French American Chamber of Commerce for 2 years, processing visas for French interns and trainees who were coming to the United States. So did that for 2 years, and then I kind of wanted to move on to something else, so got my master's in professional French, and through that, I was required to do an internship. So I did my internship in Paris in an events and trade show company where I did marketing and communications, so I did a lot of market research, white papers, generating content for trends, business plans, executive.
This is all really high level. You're doing this all in French, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then that position, I do think it was an advantage that I spoke English, because at the time the CEO of the company was British, so all the documents had to be in French and English. So I was able to help with that. Then I shifted to I got hired full time after my internship, and I was on a communications position it was for an event that was happening in Algeria, so everything was in English. I mean, in French. Nothing was in English. So I did like social media, press relations, website, visitor communications, emailing, like all that stuff for them for like 6 months, and then I moved to my current role as a trade advisor in May.
That's really neat. I'm hearing all this, and I'm just like, and I imagine people who are learning languages would be like, how do you even get to that level where you can, because no, I'm serious. Like, if you're writing like white papers in French, and like this is business French at this point, right? Which is like, God level tier. To be totally fair, because it's hard enough, like we said before, it's hard enough to do all this in English, and to be able to do that in your second language is pretty amazing. But there exists a barrier. So people who are listening to this might think like there is a barrier that exists to getting to that God level tier of language. When you're learning French, when did that start to click over, where you realize that like you were no longer necessarily like we're all still students of language, but like you're now no longer like work in progress, you are now functional. Where did that turnover happen?
I would say it probably happened after my master's, and I don't say that because I'm not saying you have to get a master's in a language to get to proficiency. I pretty much got a master's because I was like, this is what I need to do to get to the next level of the pay grade that I'm looking for. Or stay at my current job for another 6 years to get enough experience, which I didn't want to do. Sure. So I think it was after my master's, and what it did give me, my master's, was that like the confidence that I needed, because when I was studying abroad, I like didn't feel that confidence. When I was an assistant in Normandy, I didn't really feel that way. Like I definitely felt like I was progressing, I was learning a lot, but I think that after doing my master's, I was kind of like, they kind of enabled me to tell myself like, you have just as much right to be there as everyone else. And I'm sure you've talked about this on your podcast before. But like learning another language and then working in that language, or even just communicating in that language, is like the ultimate imposter syndrome, because you're always I don't feel like this isn't my language, this isn't my culture, I don't know what's going on, I don't deserve to be here, like I don't have anything to offer. And I was also lucky that when I was doing my internship, like it was a really great company, and they were really like, you are here, we picked you to be here, right? Like we didn't pick you just because you speak English. Like we picked you because of your profile, we picked you because of your skills, and we wouldn't have picked you, this wasn't an internship for you to learn French. Like we picked you because we knew your French was already good. So like obviously you're gonna make mistakes, and you're gonna learn, and you're always gonna have those like hilarious experiences where you're like, oh my god, I totally put my foot completely in my mouth. But like I think that was like during my internship was when I was really like, no, like I deserve, and then when I got my second position with the same company, like there was no English in that role at all, so they really only picked me because of my other like skills, my other skill set, like communications and stuff like that. And so I was like, well, they picked me to do this. Like they could have picked all these other interns like that wouldn't have had any visa issues, that wouldn't have required any time commitment for them, like they could have started right away, and they took a chance on me because they like appreciated my skill set and my profile. And so like that must show that my French is good enough that it's not even a question that they're asking anymore, like, oh, is she gonna be okay doing all this in French? It's like they didn't even ask that. So that was when I was like, but I think it was probably before that I actually did, like I actually had the capabilities, you know what I mean? But like it wasn't until someone was kind of like, you can do this, that I was like, I can do this, like it was it was like the outside validation, I think, was like super key to giving me the confidence I need, if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. I think before we mentioned about like sort of how elitist language learning circles tend to be, but I think on the flip side of that, it's that also that language learners tend to be pretty hard on themselves as well. Yeah, like more so, because the thing is, like, if bilingualism or multilingualism is the norm elsewhere, right, then there's a wider what do you call this, differential between skill levels, right? Whereas when you're like in an environment that is largely monolingual, and you're like this, I don't know, this unicorn that like speaks more than one language, I don't know, the selection bias that happens with that. You're in the company of some very, very competent people,
Right, yeah.
We were talking before about the company that I contract for now, and like basically I had to make this vocabulary quiz test in German. I don't speak German. And my supervisor was like, "Oh, don't think about it too much. It's fine." And then I turned in my work, and then like all the comments on the Google Doc were like, is this German? And I was like, "You speak German too? Does everyone speak German? And I'm the only one who doesn't speak German." And so it's so easy to feel so like incompetent because again, I feel language learning world is like very nerdy, and people who are into it are really into it, and they're also really, really smart. And it's really easy to feel kind of like, to have that imposter syndrome and to feel like you're, but to keep yourself grounded, you realize that, more people in the world are multilingual rather than not. And so if you put yourself in that grander scheme of things, then I don't know, you seem a lot more competent than you actually are, or you think yourself to be. I think a lot of like, as a language teacher, and this is, what you're doing right now is kind of like, the dream. I hope that my students are able to. It's not just the fact that you're able to capitalizing. They're able to kind of like use your skills in a way that really executes what you want to do. But I would love for my students to get to that point, right? Whether it's not just in like language ability, but also like the passion that you have for it. But you've been through a lot of French classrooms, right? I think that's fair to say. Yeah. And obviously we talked a little bit about like where that turning point was, and that really has less to do with pedagogy, less to do with like teacher, the quality of the teacher as much as it is to do with your own personal investment, which is very important. But what about what was your experiences like in the classroom, and for the good things and the bad things? Because I think in any classroom there's a good mix of both.
Well, I will say, again, shout out to Mr. Flood, because that classroom was super. We had a ton of just he was so activity focused. Like everything we did was like when we were learning how to order in a restaurant, he brought in menus from a cafe that he had like taken from Paris, and it's called the De Magot. It's a very famous cafe in Paris.
I remember you talking about.
Our whole unit was going to the De Magot, like how to get there on the metro, what to order when you get there. And at the time, I was like, this is so dumb. Why are we basing this all about this one cafe? Go to Paris, see the cafe, just burst into tears because I was like, oh my god, I'm here. So I made it.
That's adorable.
So that class is actually at the time I thought it was, I was in 7th grade, so I was like, oh my god, no.
I remember you talking about
this is the worst. This guy is trying to make me play pretend. I don't care. It's too cool for school. But it was actually like super useful. I will say that like in my experience, and maybe this is, I don't want to generalize, but like in my experience, a lot of the time people who end up teaching French teach French because they were hired as Spanish teachers and got the opportunity to speak French, which is awesome. And like, if that's the way that French continues, like, great. And it probably helps them make synergies in between the two languages. Very business word, not synergy. But it means that you're a lot less likely to encounter a French teacher who is a heritage speaker or a native speaker. Yeah. It's just not something that's very common. Yeah. Again, probably because of the fact that, like, Spanish is more useful in the U.S. There are more people who grew up speaking Spanish or have, like, cultural ties to Spanish-speaking countries. So you're a lot less likely to come across a native speaker teacher, which, like, has pros and cons. If you don't have a native speaker teacher, they can kind of perhaps better understand the difficulties you're having because they went through them themselves. But, like, in terms of phonology and stuff, you're not getting the accent, you're not getting, like, the culture as much of someone who is growing up in that background. So, like, I didn't have a native speaker as a teacher until I went to college. And then when I went to college, all my professors were native speakers. Okay. So, really, like, big shift. And in college, it was kind of like, I came in as a declared French major, so it was kind of already expected that, like, you had a certain level, which I think I did, but, like, the focus was always on, I had one technical, like, language learning class when I first got there. It was, like, a combo. It was basically, like, a wrap-up of, this is everything that you need to know, and after this, your classes are just going to be French lit or French culture classes. So after that, you'd write a paper, they would correct you and comment on your grammar, like, within the framework of the paper, but it wasn't ever like, okay, today we're going to have a language learning class. It was like, today we're discussing, Victor Hugo, and, oh, you made this mistake, so I'm going to explain to you why it's wrong, but we're going to continue the language, just like the literature discussion. So when I got to France for the first time, that meant that I had a super high level academically, but, like, had subsequently forgotten all of the day-to-day vocab that I learned in 7th grade, so I couldn't, like, ask for a spoon at the dinner table. I distinctly remember that, and it was also, my teachers were very good about making us speak, but it was like a literature and culture degree, so a lot of it was writing, and I was somewhat paralyzed to speak when I got there. Like the first time, I remember I forgot a toothbrush, and I remember I was like, oh, I'll just go buy a toothbrush. Like, that's pretty easy. You know how to say that. It's very easy. and I went into the pharmacy. They were behind the counter. You had to ask for them, and I was like, nope, not today. And so like the next day I was like, okay, I gotta go buy a toothbrush, and I went in and I was like, nope, can't do it. And the third day, like the only thing that motivated me was I was like, you have been in France for 3 days and you have not brushed your teeth. Like this is like your mother would kill you right now. Your
quality of living.
You're a disgusting person. Like get in there and just ask for it. And then I did, and it was fine. But yeah, I mean, I think that like I think that having a native speaker as a teacher, like obviously that's like the ideal, I think, for me, just because you're getting so much of the accent is really, that will always, if you have a very strong accent, maybe this is just in French because French people are very attached to their language, and like they're I think more I've had experiences with Spanish speakers where I've made a sentence and was like, bus go that way, you follow, and they'd be like, oh, great job. And whereas if I did that in French, they'd be like, you idiot, like they're a lot more hard on people who learn their language. And I think that you could speak very, very good French, but if you have a really bad accent, like they're going to perceive you as speaking bad French, So I think that like having that would be ideal. But I think that, I don't think I had a bad language learning experience in like grade school and stuff. I just think that once I got to Georgetown, I was kind of like, oh, okay, like these people are really serious about this. Like this is not, I think for better or for worse, most people know that in high school most people, they're taking it because they feel like they have to. Yeah. Whereas if by the time you get to college, it's like, well, yeah, everybody did have to take a language like at Georgetown, like I said, and obviously Spanish and French were the most popular because people already had a basis in that. But, like, the teachers pretty much made it clear that they were like, I don't care if you're doing this for a language requirement or you're doing this... We had it separated, too. We didn't have all our classes. Like, you could do language for majors and language for non-majors. But some of the electives were crossover, and they were like, we don't care why you're here, Like, we're teaching our class. This is what I got my PhD in. I'm freaking passionate about it. So if you're just here to fulfill your language requirement, that's fine, but I'm not going to treat you. Like, you're not getting a... Yeah. You're not getting a pass because, like, oh, you're just here for the language requirement? I don't care.
Wow. That sounds like a super high pressure and scary, but also really, if everyone is on board, right? If there's an overarching culture that really encourages that, that's a super cool space to be in. I asked this question to Rachel when she was on the pod. Was French and Spanish and, like, most normal languages with grammar have things like verb conjugation, like very nitty gritty sort of things that like in a lot of classrooms you just end up memorizing because it's like seen as the most efficient way to. But once you actually become fluent in that language, you're not thinking about how to conjugate the verbs. When did that turnover happen for you? When you went from like this is a verb that I'm actively like conjugating verb endings to like this is just what sounds right. When did that turnover happen?
I think probably in study abroad. Because that was when I was just speaking the most. And also what was funny in study abroad was that, like, like most languages, French has, like, a formal and an informal you. And you get pretty used to just doing the informal one, like, with your classmates and stuff like that. You're going to use the formal with the teacher, but that's about it. Whereas, like, then you go there and everybody is a formal person, right? Because you don't know them. You're in a cafe. You're, like, at the store. People start talking to you, even as a young person, like once you get past like high school, people will be talking to you with like a formal you. And I was like, oh my God, I have to remember that conjugation. I don't know that conjugation for like any verbs. But I think, once, I was taking classes there, right? Like I was in a French university when I was studying abroad. And that was when I was like really like, okay, I just have to figure out what comes out of my mouth and not think about it as much. And I think you get hung up on it too. Like, you're like, okay, conditional, tense, like, whatever. And when you're in the environment, that thought process kind of starts to get eliminated just by factor of the fact that, like, in function of the fact, I guess I should say that you have to, like, something has to come out of your mouth now. Like, someone is asking you a question and you need to respond. So maybe you'll respond and you won't do the right thing, but you won't even have the time to be like, oh, that should have been in the past tense or whatever. You'll just figure it out. And I think your brain is really good at, like, learning on the spot in that sense. Like, and people will, if they're good friends, they'll correct you in a way that's helpful for your brain. Like, I think what's very helpful and what I try to do with my friends who want to work on their English is, like, they say something to me in English, it's not correct, I'll respond using the correct formulation. So it's like, you didn't do this correctly, but, like, here's how you would say it without being like, you didn't do this correctly, because that just feels like a terrible thing when that happens to you. So did I answer your question?
No, it definitely does. I think Yeah, I feel like, I don't know, I was thinking back to your toothbrush story, and I'm just like, there is a component of learning a language that if you're a socially anxious person like I am, it's like, it builds into every single, like, insecurity you could ever have. Because it's hard enough already to talk to strangers, you know? And then to do it in a place where you actively run the very high risk of looking stupid. Yeah. Like, it puts it on a whole different level. And, like, one thing that I adapted to quickly was realizing that, like, when you're speaking a language, by virtue of the sheer fact that you're not totally, like, native fluent, you then have permission to sound stupid. Yeah. And it's like the foreigner rule, right? You know, like, as long as, like, you, I don't know, depending on how shameless you are, like, to make it abundantly aware that this is, to others, that this is not your first language, you know, then people tend to be, I mean, at least in Chinese-speaking circles where people tend to be pretty easily impressed, you know, you can get away with, like, making a lot of mistakes, because you're right, like, when you're in a situation like that, you don't have time to be a perfectionist about what you're saying. Whatever comes out of your mouth, as long as it's, like, comprehensible, that's all that matters at the moment, and then, like, consequences be damned. And so I think, honestly, that's, like, in the classroom for me, that is a very big hurdle to take my students over, because, you know, this is the case in a lot of, like, classrooms, right? Like, everything is graded on a 0 to 100 scale. You're either wrong or you're right. And with language, you're going to be consistently wrong for a very, very long time. You're going to be wrong even as a native speaker. And so it seems almost pointless to be so fixated on, like, getting things right. You know what I mean?
And I know, like, France, the way their education system is, I mean, first of all, I will say that this is why, you know, compared to other countries, France and Europe is, like, very bad at English, like, compared to Sweden or, like, Germany. French, I mean, in general, the level of English in Southern European countries is a lot worse than Northern European countries, or even, like, Czechoslovakia. But not Czechoslovakia, that's two different countries now. But really it's very, so, but they're, you know, so a lot of times, like, my friends who are my age will get themselves down, like, about their English level and stuff, considering that they watch American movies. A big difference that I found out when I was talking to my friend who's Dutch is that in France, all of the American cultural, like, stuff that they consume, movies, TV shows, whatever, when it's on TV, it's dubbed. It's always dubbed. Whereas in, like, the Netherlands, it's always in English with subtitles, and that makes a huge difference, because you can change it in French. Like, if you're watching on TV and you want to watch it in the original version with subtitles, you can change it, but that's like, you have to take the initiative to do that. So always getting down on themselves about, like, English and stuff. But I'm like, in France, you start learning English in, like, end of elementary school-ish. And then you're required to add a second language. So everybody in France is required to take, usually English as their first language, and then Spanish or German as the second language. Some schools have other options, but, like, that's mostly the case. Then when you get to high school, if you really have, like, an affinity for Spanish or really an affinity for German, you can switch that to being your primary, which just means that you'll have more hours of it per week. But for most people, like, it's expected that the primary is English. And their education system is really focused on, like, it's very traditional, and it's, like, it's writing, it's, like, you know, like, repetition and stuff like that. Then speaking is not as, it's not a priority for them. And the way they're, I mean, this is probably similar to other cultures as well, but, like, they're a lot less American schools where it's like, oh, we're going to play a game. Like I said, we're going to pretend we're in a cafe or whatever. And there it's like, no, we're learning this. We're, you know, it's like,
is this because of, like, a test? Like, is this because of standardized tests?
So, I mean, part of it, I think, is because of a test, because, like, it's kind of, like in England, they have like, A levels called the back. It's like, most countries have, in Europe, have it at the end of high school. You have to pass it. If you don't pass it, you will not have a future, basically.
Great.
Depending on what specialization you've picked in high school, which you have to specialize, I won't get into all of it, but yeah, your subjects are worth different coefficients. So, like, if you're choosing to specialize in literature, your languages will be worth, like, your language score will be times the higher coefficient toward the total score. Whereas if you're doing science, it will be times the less coefficient, and you'll have less hours per week and everything like that, which affects their motivation as well, because, like, some of my students was like, well, I could get a 3 on this and still pass, so I'm not going to try that hard. But I was helping students prepare for the end of the year exam when I was there. That was, like, my main role. And they were just, like, they have a whole section, which is really hard. I could not have done this in French at the end of high school. But the test in English is you study these 4, they call them notions, these 4 themes throughout the whole year. And you do, like, they call them sequences on them in each notion. So one of them is, like, places and exchanges. And so that one, they all do the American dream and immigration. And so they learn a lot about that. So the idea is that the day of the test, they pick it out of a hat. So say they get, you know, ideas and exchanges or whatever I just said. Then they have 15 minutes to prepare a 5-minute talk about it.
Ooh.
And which, in theory, they should be able to do because they had a whole thing about it, so they can, they can take notes and everything, but they can't bring anything with them. So then they have to speak for like 3 minutes uninterrupted, and then the professor will ask them questions about it that they have to be able to respond to. And they are just paralyzed, like they cannot speak. And I remember one time being with a student, and when I was with them, I would be giving them grades. It was like a class grade that I would give them. And I was like, look, Geraldine, you just have to say something. Like, I can't give you a 0 if you just say, hello, my name is Geraldine. Like, just say something. And she was like, I can't. Like, I'm too scared. Wow. I was like, why? And it was also hilarious because I would often get the response, oh, but like, madame, you don't understand what it's like. I was like, I don't understand what it's like. This is my day to day. I go to the bakery and they're like, oh, you have an accent. And I'm like, yeah, I do. Can I just get some bread? You know what I mean? Like, yeah. So, I mean, I think that that's like a problem, like, worldwide. It's really hard to get people to speak because it's hard to make yourself look like an idiot, like, voluntarily, especially when you're at the point. And that's why it's really hard for adult learners, I think, because, like, I know, like, my mom with Spanish, like, she's like, I struggle so much with speaking. I just am so scared to make a mistake and stuff like that. And I was like, people tend to be nicer than you think that they're going to be, even in a culture like France where they are very hard on you. And for better or for worse, most people think Americans are very dumb, and they know that we don't prioritize language learning. So when they meet an American that speaks another language, they're like, wow, like, you must be super motivated. You must be so, like, dedicated and like to have picked this language. And I know French people are like, wow, you picked French? Like, that's so cool, like, well, why would you do that? And I was like, good question. Why would I do that? No, but yeah, so I'm sorry, I went on a little tangent there,
that's really cool. Yeah. I love hearing about, like, because, like, going to the bakery, right, and, like, being so upfront about being like, I'm clearly not French, I'm just here to get my stuff done for the day, please let me on my way. How do you, because reasonably speaking, right, if I go to France, right, it's very understandable. I would literally just look like one of a billion Chinese tourists. I've accepted that reality. I'm okay with that. Yeah, it's a hard reality to accept, but I'm learning to own it. But for you like, unless you like start opening your mouth, right? By all intents and purposes, most people would assume you're French. Yeah. When is the moment? When do people realize that you're not French?
When I open my mouth, as soon as I have the accent come out. Yeah. But like, I mean, I also quickly learned to just kind of be sassy in response. Yeah. Like, I had an issue at check-in recently when I was in France, and I was going to be put on standby, and so he was like, he said in French, like, you're going to be on standby, and I was like, what? And I said in French, I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, in English, you are going to be put on the standby. And I was like, and then I just said back to him in French, I was like, the French wasn't the problem, the content was. And he was like, okay. But I just feel like you have to like clap back, otherwise they're going to, like, I mean, it's really easy, and I saw this all the time in study abroad. Like, there are people who clearly, everybody knows this, people go on study abroad to, like, party. Yeah. I mean, that's not why I went. It was a requirement for me to study abroad. It's so difficult, a requirement to study abroad. But, like, I went and I was like, this is the first time I'm ever going to a French-speaking country. Like, this is when I'm here. Like, I'm here to speak French. I'm here to make progress. I made a point to only hang out with other students, other American students. Because, I mean, you are going to hang out with mostly Americans, right? Because, like, you're in a French university, yeah, okay, but those students are there, like, they already have their friends. They're used to having Americans come for 6 months and then leave, so they don't really care. Like, they'll be nice to you, but they're not gonna... It's the same thing when you meet exchange students in the U.S., really, to be honest. Unless they're there for all 4 years, you're like, oh, okay, great, yeah, we can hang out, but, like, you're not gonna be a part of my, like, day-to-day, really. Yeah. So, you're gonna hang out with a lot of Americans, but I prioritize hanging out with people who have the same, like, objectives as me, where we're like, we came here to learn French, so we're not going to go, there were some people who were like, oh, well, this restaurant is like, you can go and speak English there, this is the American bar, and it's like, then why did you come here? I mean, this is a waste of time and parents' money and your own money. So I forgot why I started on this, but like, yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I kind of tried to prioritize it. But at the beginning, it was really hard because they will hear, especially in Paris, like, they'll hear you have an accent. They'll be like, okay, you're an American tourist. I'm going to speak to you in English. It's going to make my life easier. It's going to make your life easier. It's not, because your English is probably worse than my French, to be honest. Like, if I was in Germany, I'd be like, yes, let's speak English, because A, I don't speak German, but B, Germans are incredible. They'll come up to you and be like, I would love to apologize for my terrible English, which has many faults in it. And you're like, hello, I are English speaker, please. Like, yeah, but I mean, one, my French is probably better than your English at this point. Two, I know you want to practice, but this is like, the... And so you really have to make an effort to be like, okay, I'm going to speak French, I'm going to speak French, I'm going to speak French. And now I've gotten to the point where, initially people would always, they would automatically switch to English if they spoke English. And I would have to say to them, like, did I stutter? because I was like, or I would be like, did you not understand me? Because if you didn't understand me, then that's a potential, like, maybe you actually didn't understand me, in which case, like, I need to work on that. But if you understood me, I would just say, like, I know I have an accent, but I'm here to learn French. And usually they're really appreciative. They were like, oh, okay, sorry, I just thought, it would be easier. You thought incorrectly. But now, yeah, most of the time when I go, like, I'll get the reaction of, okay, you're not from here, where are you from? That's, like, kind of best case scenario for me, because I just don't want them to, I don't want to automatically have them be like, oh, you have an American accent. Yeah. Sometimes people will think I'm French Canadian, but they don't really think I'm French Canadian, because I definitely don't have a French Canadian accent. But I think it's a way of kind of saying, I think French people really kind of have, like, a whole thing about Quebecois. And so it's kind of a nice way of saying, like, you speak very good French, but there's something that's not quite right here. So, or, like, they'll be like, oh, well, was one of your parents French, but you grew up in the U.S. or something, which is, yeah, same thing. It's kind of a way of saying, like, oh, your French is good, but what's happening?
I feel like there's, amongst language learners, there's a wide spectrum of opinions on this, but is your accent, your American accent, something that you are owning and being like, this is just how I talk, or is it something that you're actively trying to, like, transition out of?
I am actively trying to transition out of it, but I do think that this kind of depends on the language you're learning, too, because, like, I personally feel that French is such a, like, beautiful language that I hear how I say it, and then I hear how a French person says it, and I'm like, ugh, it sounds so bad when I say it, Whereas, like, but the perception of it, I mean, people have a lot of shame regarding accents and stuff. You really, I mean, you can't not, in a way, but you also, like, you shouldn't, because just how you in English would probably run into someone with an accent and think, oh my gosh, like, either how cute or, like, how exotic or how interesting, this is a problematic word, but, how interesting, where are you from? And, I mean, I think that people think it's very cute, actually, in France, which is not how I perceive it, just because I'm like, oh, I'm butchering your language, but they're more like, oh, how, like, so cute that I mean, which is kind of how we would think about it a lot of times in the U.S., and I think that more, I mean, the fact of the matter is you have an accent, acknowledge it, try to be like, move past it. Sometimes I will say stuff in French and I'll be like, I'm not going to say that word because I can't say it with my accent. So you guys know what I'm talking about, but it happens to be, there's a specific cake, I can't say it. It has an M-O-E, the joined O and E, M-O-E.
Did not know that was a letter in French.
L-L-E-U-X. One time I tried it, my friend was like, why don't you try to say it? And I was like, look, there's a O, there's like 7 vowels, an L, which is kind of pronounced like a vowel, and a silent X. It's gonna be a no for me. It's not coming out of this American mouth,
So how would you describe it? How would you work around, like,
usually I'm like, if possible, I'll point to it, and I'll be like, can I have that one over there? And then they'll say it, and I'll be like, it's called the moilieu, which is...
Okay, I can see your point.
You can see it's very difficult to say. Or I'll be like, oh, do you have any chocolate cakes? And they'll be like, oh, the moilieu? And I'm like, yes, I'll have that one. Like, you get really good at doing a workaround. And I think that's something super important that you kind of can only learn when you're there, in a way, because, like, you will be like, I don't know the word, I can't look it up on my word reference on my phone or whatever. And you have to be like, okay, well, how can I say this in another way? And my host mom was a really good example of this, because I really thought that she would speak some English. She did, I mean, she's from kind of a different, she was born right after the war, so she learned her German in school. I guess they were kind of always like, who knows, it could happen again. So she didn't really speak English at all, except for that what she had picked up from movies and stuff like that. So one night at dinner, like I was saying, I was like, oh, you gave me some soup, I need a thing you eat the soup with. And she's kind of like, what? And I was like, not cute. A fork, not a knife. And she's like, a spoon?
20 questions.
Yeah. She's like, you don't know the word for spoon? She's like, well, I do now. So there was a lot of that with her, because, really adorable. Which is very great.
Yeah. What you do with the cakes is what I do when I see, like, a Chinese character that I don't know how to read, but I can, like, read in part of it, and I'll just kind of, like, circumlocute my way, because I can kind of, I don't know, my Taiwanese friends could probably, like, roast me on this, but, like, I've been told that I can pass for a Taiwanese person if I don't speak for any longer than 5 minutes. After that, I just start like my brain just runs out of bandwidth, and I just start like, but I think the great part about having like a, not necessarily like a native like a handle on the language, is that you are able to kind of circumlocute and get your point across. without actually having to say the word. This is something I try to tell my students all the time because they are very fixated on, like, if I don't know how to say that exact word, I'm not going to say anything at all. Right, yeah. I'm like, no, it's like, you have to use your brain a little bit, like, think a little creatively, because that actually is what, like, actually learn new words and or pronunciations that same way. You had a really funny story about, and I feel like a lot of multilingual people get thrown into this. I've been thrown into this personally at church, where I was told to translate a prayer on the spot. Church Chinese is very different.
Yeah, I imagine.
But you had a case when you were was this in France or was this in...
So when I went to Algeria...
Okay. Not France.
Yeah, but they speak French.
Francophone, yes.
Yeah, Francophone. And I was at an event, and my boss was asked to give a speech, which she hadn't prepared anything for, and someone said, oh, it's a shame that you're going to give a speech in French when there's going to be so many international people here who don't speak French. We should have thought ahead. We should have prepared something in English. And she was like, well, Katrina speaks English. Like, why don't we just do an interpretation? And I just looked at her, and I said, like, this is something that people go to school and get degrees in. This is not something that you do in front of 200 people live, like, on the spot.
It's hard.
It's super hard. And so, also I was like, hey, it's okay. I don't want to do this, but I'm kind of, I don't really have a choice, so fine, I'll do this. But you need to talk slowly. You need to stop after every sentence and let me translate. Obviously, that didn't happen. And, kind of like what we were talking about before, there's some things I only talk about certain stuff in French. So then when I get to the moment, I'm like, wait, how do I say that in English? What is the word for that in English? And just come off sounding like an idiot. So bumbling my way through that, was super just flustered afterward. And I was kind of circulating in the crowd, and this one guy came up to me, and he was like, I know that you could tell that you were kind of put on the spot there, but you did a great job. Your English is so good. And I just was like, well, if I can master my native language, like, that's a good start.
But that's like the ultimate compliment, Like, so that means that your French was, like, pretty passable, Oh, man, that's so neat. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like by being multilingual, on the one hand, it depends on what people you're around, but some people definitely grossly overestimate your abilities. I definitely get this in school because I'm like, there's only one other Chinese teacher at my school, and we don't interact that much because she teaches the littles. But I've been called into, like, we have international students from China at our school. The number of times I've been called in to do translation work on, like, this student has a medical problem, or this student has, like, a serious social, personal conflict with this other person, and you are the conduit to, like, that. And I'm just like, this is too much. I can't even do this in English. But you're right. It's a very high pressure thing. Don't take your multilingual friends for granted.
Right?
So it's like, like, we're talking. I feel like a lot of what we're talking about is just like talking about how language learning is a deeply emotional, like, challenging in ways that are not just cognitive, right?
Yeah.
What are a couple of things what are a couple of ways that, like, you've managed to, like, overcome that sort of emotional challenge of not only speaking of the language, but also you learned a good amount of French before even going to France for the first time. And so I can't even imagine how that, like, expectation must be to be like, I have all this head knowledge and now it's finally been put to the test.
Yeah. It's like, I think that's a good example because everybody was so excited to go study abroad, and I was like, I did not want to go. I mean, part of it was I kind of had a hard time at school when I was first at school. I was super homesick. Like, Georgetown really, love my school, like, Hoya Saxa till I die. But, it was very hard because I was with all these students from elite private schools, elite Catholic schools, like, people who grew up summering, like, in Singapore. That's just a thing my roommate did. Like,
when summering is a verb.
Yeah, exactly. Like... And I was just like, I come from a really privileged town. My parents are, like, doing great and everything. But I was like, I feel so poor here and not worldly. And I can't even imagine how a student from, like, an actual, like, lower income neighborhood area would might have felt. Anyway, so I was very homesick at school. And so I was like, how am I going to deal with being abroad where I'm going to be 6 hours ahead of my family? I don't even know if I'm going to have a working phone. Like, I've never been to France before. And at this point, I was a junior, so I had already declared my major. I couldn't really change it without, like, severely delaying my graduation, which was not an option. And so there was this whole thing in my brain that was like, what if you get there and you can't make yourself understood? And it's like all this work at this point, I mean, if you're, I don't really count, I always say that I count from middle school to high school as basically like 2 years of French. Because that's how much it would have been at Georgetown. Yeah. And, but, started when I was 12, like, age 20. Now it's been 8 years that I've been working on this. What if I go and I suck so badly and I have to be like, this is what I chose to major in. Like, my whole life choice is, like, on the line, you know? It's really hard when you're learning a language not to... Because it's like, it's based on communication, right? Communication is such a basic thing. It's like you feel, like I said, you have these basic questions that you feel like an idiot because you can't figure out how to say them. You feel like it's super humbling. And which is why I think everybody should do it, because everybody should have the experience of being outside their comfort zone. It really makes you be like, appreciate what you have when you're at home. Just simple things like, I know how to go do this in the United States, like go to the post office. What a annoying thing, but I can do this because I did. It's a huge motivator for me now, you know, because there'll be things that I don't want to do or administratively annoying or I'm kind of like nervous about. Like, well, I did it in France, so I can definitely do it in the US. Like, I live here. This is where I'm from. But I think, you know, obviously, like I said, outside validation really helps. But before even I was choosing, like, I think you have to be really motivated. Like, I was always so motivated outside the classroom. Like, I wasn't just doing the homework, you know, like, I pretty early on started listening to French radio, watching French movies, like, trying to watch French movies with French subtitles, and same thing with Spanish. And just because I was always thinking, well, this is just a plus, right? Like, I can always do more. And your brain, it's like doing a sport. Like, if you don't do it for a period of time, you do get rusty and your confidence gets super rusty. So working on it outside the classroom, I think made me feel like, okay, I'm doing everything I can. You know, I'm doing everything I can to get better at this. I'm seeing progress, but it is really hard. Like, I mean, for me, I always say this to people that I'm not French. Like, I always explain to French people all the time, I have no, like, family link to France. I have no reason to, just something I love, you know, super cliche, like American goes to Paris, falls in love with the country, but it's the truth. And so it does feel super personal when I make mistakes or when I feel like I can't communicate, because it almost feels like a part of me now, you know, like a part of my identity is like loving France. And sometimes I feel more me when I'm speaking French than when I'm speaking English in some contexts.
Yeah.
So it can be really hard to not take something like that to, you know.
Literally every person who has guessed it who speaks more than one language has said that. Like, without prompting. Just saying. Maybe there's something to that. That idea that, like, when you speak another language, you know, either, like you said, feel more like yourself, or you unlock a part of yourself that would be inaccessible. Which I think is such an oddly specific thing, but it's something that I feel like is pretty universal amongst people who speak languages. You mentioned before, this wasn't on our list, but I thought it was kind of interesting. Do you, given, like, you know, the time that you spent in France, do you feel like, you know, in some ways politically or like socially, are you more invested in France as a country, as a people?
For sure. I like always, well, also because, you know, now I have a lot of friends there, so I kind of keep up with stuff because I, you know, ask them about how things are going, and like right now there's a huge strike going on in France, so like we kind of talk about that. And it's also interesting because I feel like they have such an interesting perspective on American politics. Like, for me, I would describe myself in the US as like progressive to the left, blah, 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 you know, whatever. But in France, I'm pretty conservative because I'm like, hey, welcome to America where we don't have these things, you know, like, so, but yeah, I am very invested in it. I try not to have super political discussions with French people because they always think I'm super conservative, and I'm like, I'm not. I promise you I'm not, but like, it's all relative, right? And I also, I mean, I do know a lot about it from living there, but I would hardly say, like, there's so much like cultural and historical and political stuff that I don't know, and so many references I don't have, that I don't want to get myself in a situation where I'm like, this is so dumb that people are protesting over this, and like, oh, actually it's because of this like huge, you know, union legacy of whatever. So, you know, I want to be careful and, like, respectful of, like, where I am. Like, speak from a place of knowledge and not a place of just, like, whatever. And it's very easy to come off as, like, I'm American, I know everything. But I am very invested in the
Was
culture.
it something that came naturally, like, or was it something that you actually had to, like, actively seek out? Because
I think both. Like, it did come naturally, but... Like I said, I mean, for instance, with this strike, I was like, I have no idea what this is about. Like, I don't understand. I mean, I'm reading the article. I understand in theory, but like, where is this coming from? What is the motivation for this? So I had to go back and read other articles about, well, this is why they have such an attachment to this thing, and this is why, you know, this government has tried to do this, and that's why people are reacting in this way. So it was, I mean, it's natural because when you live there, you care. Like, you won't, I mean, like, so I was there when Notre Dame caught fire. And, like, I had, like, a visceral response, you know, and it happened to be, like, one of my last days in Paris, so it was even more, like, poignant for me. I don't know if that's the right word, because it was more, like, tragic, but I used to go, I have, like, this tradition whenever I'm in France that I will go to see Notre Dame on my last day there, even if it's for, like, a trip, and I was just like, I can't go, because I'm just gonna be, like, I literally couldn't, because it was blocked off, but it was just, like, people who are not, I mean, French people are not very religious, not like Spain, where there's a lot more of a traditional, like, cultural Catholicism. I mean, France, in theory, but, like, day to day, like, there are not many practicing Catholics, so it's not about a religious thing. I mean, for me, it kind of was, but for most people there, they were just like, this is, like, our culture, this is just, like, our history, and so I felt like I reacted like someone who lived there to the extent that I could have. And same thing when there have been terrorist attacks in France. I was there for the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which were in January 6th, 7th, 9th, something like that. I wasn't in Paris, but I had been like next door to where that happened like a week before. And the night that the attacks happened on November 13th, I like knew people who were at the concert and stuff like that, who were thankfully okay, but you get really like, and you know, now I made it to like, so I get alerts about what's happening in France and stuff like that, because I just feel like I'm super invested. Like a part of myself is there. So much of me is me because of France. Do you know what I mean? Like,
and even that, like, I mean, not to bring this back to this utilitarian, like, well, this is useful for learning language, but I feel like having an empathy for people.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
When you're getting to a point like that, people talk about that language plateau all the time, right? Like when you are close to native fluency, but you're just not there, and that like last, hill is hard to climb. It really, for me as well, and I imagine the same for you, it comes down to like, it has to come alive to you in the way that you interact with people. Like you can't, even when it comes to like communication, like, communicating with a random stranger for utilitarian purposes is one thing, but like your language ability grows when you have an empathetic impetus to sort of continue pursuing it, right? Like when I don't know, like there's a comedian in Taiwan that like, it's amazing that Taiwan hasn't had its own version of The Daily Show, because Taiwanese politics is insane. Like, people throw chairs at each other in Parliament. It's incredible. But, like, talking about, like, reading and talking about politics and in any language is challenging. And so, but because of Taiwan's, like, precarious political situation, and because, like, I want to watch The Daily Show in Chinese. Like, give me a break. That affinity you have for the people, that awareness that you have, it kind of, like, builds on each other, right? You have a greater empathy for the people, greater concern for what's happening, and then as a result of that, you want to learn and read and listen to more, and it just like language acquisition becomes really natural at that point. So, one last question, just for practical purposes. What are some tools that you've used? Because you speak, I'm just going to say you speak 5 languages, because that's, sounds really cool. But in your language learning journey, what are some like tools, apps, websites, things that you found to be super useful for you?
Yeah, so almost all countries have like public radio, like the equivalent of NPR. That's super useful. There's a lot of countries that will also offer that in slow versions. So if you look up like slow news in Italian or something, you'll find it. That's really good because it's usually vocab that's relevant, obviously, because it's in the news, and it's slower, you can follow it, so that's really good. So listening to those, like, podcasts and stuff like that, that's very helpful. I used Duolingo for a while. I didn't love it because once you kind of master the tree, it's kind of, that's it.
I hate, like, when the tree starts, like, decaying, and you have to,
you just have to refresh. It's annoying.
It's the worst.
So now I use Memrise for Arabic, Italian, and Spanish. I did make a small mistake when I signed up for the my Italian is Italian to French instead of Italian to English. So which is kind of cool, and now I can't change it because I'm like invested, I'm like I gotta. So all the other ones are like Spanish, English, and Arabic, English, but the other one is Italian, French. So I do Memrise every day. I took an Italian class through If You Live in New York Fluent City, so they're really great because their focus is on speaking. Like, they will teach you grammar, but like the idea is like they're forcing you to speak. They know that most adults are learning it because they want to go to Italy or they want to like do whatever. So that I really enjoyed. Now children can learn much easier than I could because Netflix has a ton of foreign films, so like that's been super helpful. Watching films, so I always recommend, like, I mean, if you're really not going to understand, obviously do the English subtitles, but if you are at a level where you think you can get by, like get the general idea of things, to put the subtitles in the like the closed captioning subtitles. There's also, if you're watching on your computer, there's an app, like a Google Chrome extension you can download. I think it's called like Netflix for Language or something. If you Google that, it'll come up, where it'll put the subtitles in both languages. So it'll put like English on the top and whatever the language is on the bottom, which can be useful sometimes where you're like, I want to have it in the language, but I'm not understanding what's going on. That's really helpful. What else have I done? I always try to, you know, this can be hard, and obviously you want to be respectful of like the other person too, but if I meet someone that speaks one of the languages, you know, to be like, hey, would you be okay with me like chatting with me in Spanish for like 10 minutes and then we can go back to English, but I just want to practice a little bit. You have to be a little bit careful because you don't want the person to perceive it as like, oh, your English isn't good, so I want to speak to you. But like, you know, I mean, most people are perfectly willing to do that. Language partners are super helpful. We did language partners a lot at Georgetown for Arabic, which is really helpful. And I'm trying to think what else I do. Oh, music is really, really, because I mean, everybody knows this. This is like a phenomenon that they aren't able to totally document, that like musical memory is, people who have Alzheimer's like don't forget music. So if you can start learning via music, like if you're listening to pop, it'll really help you kind of get on the young people lingo and hello you kids, and also it just helps you, you know, it'll stay in your brain, you know, you'll learn it because it'll get stuck in your head. And even if you and it also gives you something to talk about, right, with people would be like, oh yeah, I know that song. Like, what, you know that song? That's crazy.
Any suggestions for music? For French?
For French, well, Stromae is like La Base, which everybody knows Stromae.
Yes.
He had a collab with Kanye West. But so he hasn't put out new music in a while, but he's really good. Big Flo and Oli, really good. Those are French rappers. Vlad is kind of like trap, if you're into that sort of thing. Veggie Dream was this guy who made a song about the French winning the World Cup, so called Ramener la coupe à la maison, which was like huge, you know, it was like, oh yeah, we won the World Cup. What else have I listened to a lot lately? Aya Nakamura, she is from Mali originally, so it's like Afro pop, which is cool. For Spanish, Ozuna, gotta love Ozuna. He's basically the main one I listen to in Spanish. In Italian, I'm trying to think of the name of the group that I listen to. It's escaping me right now. But generally, as a starting point for music, I usually go on like Spotify top 50 or whatever, and then you'll find also a lot of American ones in there, so if your brain needs a break, then you can just kind of like listen to the whole thing, and then you're like, oh, Selena Gomez, okay, I can like, my brain can adjust. French TV shows, 10%, which is Call My Agent on Netflix, is awesome. Marseille is not awesome, but it was the first made for Netflix French show, so that was really good. La Chicas del Cable is one for Spanish, and Italian Baby is really good. I don't watch a lot of things in Arabic just because there's so many dialects that it's like it's not as useful. It's not practical. So
all right, well, thank you so much for sharing all of this. I think this is like probably one of the richest episodes we've had so far.
AKA longest.
No, I mean, well, hey, I will say that I've done, just full disclosure, I feel like, how long are we at here? Yeah, hour 15. I recorded an hour 20 yesterday by myself. I don't know. So this is, by comparison, very, very refreshing and very, very informative. And so thank you so much for coming by. Yeah, great to have you. And I hope you come back again.
Thanks for having me.
Yay. All right, bye-bye. Hey guys, it's Patricia again. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Bad Chinese Teacher podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review on Apple Podcasts to let us know how we did. And of course, if you haven't already, subscribe to this feed so you can stream the latest episodes when they drop every Monday. You can also find some fun quotables and shareables from each episode on social media. We are at Bad Chinese Teacher on Instagram, at Bad Chinese Pod on Twitter, and you can just search us up on Facebook, Bad Chinese Teacher Podcast. If you want to follow me, Patricia, you can find me on Instagram at Patricia Liu, on Twitter at Patricia SQ Liu, and you can read my latest writing on my blog at blog.patricialiu.net. All right, that does it for this week. I'll catch you next Monday for another episode discussing your favorite nerdy topics concerning the language teaching and learning world. See you there.